Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Fred Kempe, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. By the look of the size of this audience and the buzz in the audience, you know two things are happening here today. One of them is we're dealing with an issue of great urgency, and we're about to hear someone of great wisdom and significance talk about this issue and beyond. We're honored to welcome Dr. Salam Fayyad, former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, to the Atlantic Council. And beyond that, we're delighted to welcome him to the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security as our new and really our first distinguished statesman at the Atlantic Council. We have the chairman of the Scowcroft Center, General Jones, here, who will introduce him. So I'll just make a couple of remarks before passing to the Scowcroft Center chair. Dr. Fayyad adds a much-needed voice to the conversation on the future of Israeli-Palestinian relations and what this means for the broader Middle East. Over the past 3 weeks, renewed conflict between Israel and Hamas and other Palestinian groups has resulted in over 1,000 casualties, more than 4,500 wounded, and the displacement of tens of thousands. Efforts by Secretary of State John Kerry to forge a ceasefire have been insufficient thus far, as the U.S. and international leaders seem unable to bring the conflict to a halt. Now more than ever, we need fresh thinking and fresh approaches and strong leadership to a solution to one of the world's most intractable conflicts. I think you'll hear a lot of that sort of thinking today. Dr. Fayyad has a written statement, a little bit like congressional testimony, which will be outside at 5 o'clock. He'll be speaking from that statement, but in an abridged form in his opening comments before I moderate Q&A with the audience. He joins us today to build upon the important work that the Scowcroft Center's Middle East Peace and Security Initiative is doing to develop innovative strategies and analysis for a changing Middle East. I salute Barry Pavel and his team for the good work that they're doing. This complements the fantastic work of the Rafik Hariri Center on the Middle East, and I salute the acting director, Danya Greenfield, for the work that that center has been doing on the related set of issues. He also, Dr. Fayyad will also contribute to the critical work that the Council has been doing on long-term regional trends, including the growth of non-state actors in the Middle East. As a respected and accomplished leader in the region, he'll be an invaluable voice along with Ambassador Michael Oren, the Council's ambassador in residence, as the Council works to better understand the strategic implications of continued conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. I'm delighted that General Jones is here, who along with Steve Hadley, one National Security Advisor to the Democratic President, one National Security Advisor to a Republican President, have played a central role in the ongoing strategy work of the Council and the Scowcroft Center, but I also thank them both for helping to bring Dr. Fayyad as a distinguished statesman at the Council. General Jones is the chairman, as I said, of the Scowcroft Center, former National Security Advisor, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and Marine Commandant. He's been a great partner to the Atlantic Council, integral to the work of the Scowcroft Center over the past few years, but really the work across the Atlantic Council on a wide set of issues. General Jones, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome. This is a high moment for the Atlantic Council, and we are honored to be here today, and it's especially exciting for me to be able to introduce Dr. Salam Fayyad, who I came to know and admire as a highly respected leader, a statesman and a colleague while working with him on the peace process now 6 years ago, when I served as Special Envoy for Middle East regional security during 2007 and 2008, and my friend Steve Hadley was the National Security Advisor, and I think Jane Harman was still in office, and the world was a different place. I think of all the 2 years that I spent working on this issue, that one of the things I enjoyed the most during my time in the Middle East was my regular visits with Dr. Fayyad. Without any fear of exaggeration, he's a man of courage, he's a man of commitment, and he's a man of peace. And I think he's, above all, a very wise man and someone that we should continue to listen to as we struggle to find a long-lasting solution in this very, very critical part of the world. Now, the current violence unfolding in the region underscores the importance of the Middle East peace process to regional stability and also, I would suggest, global stability, and of leaders such as Salam Fayyad, who devoted their lives to building a better future for all stakeholders in the region. His reputation, of course, precedes him, hence the turnout today. He's a leader and a visionary, one who understands that human development and prosperity are impossible without good governance, and good governance is not possible without transparency and accountability. During his tenure as Prime Minister, Dr. Fayyad championed law and order in the West Bank, worked to build institutions that would meet the needs of the Palestinian people, and taught us all a lesson that the solution set is much broader than simply military activities. He was appointed as the Minister of Finance of the Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat from 2002 to 2005, and he won praise, high praise from the international community for introducing extensive economic and financial reforms and cracking down on corruption. In late 2005, he resigned from the cabinet to found and run the Third Way Bloc, an independent party that would run and win in two seats in the Palestinian parliamentary elections of January 2006. In March 2007, Dr. Fayyad was appointed again as Minister of Finance in a national unity government, and in June 2007, he was appointed Prime Minister, a position he held until he stepped down in June 2013. To echo Fred's remarks, Dr. Fayyad will be a fantastic addition to the Atlantic Council team. I look forward to working closely with him as the Scowcroft Center continues to expand its work on Middle East security, especially on Israeli-Palestinian relations and the Middle East peace process itself. And I'm certain the Scowcroft Center will become a leading voice on this critical issue. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Salam Fayyad to the podium.
Thank you so much. Very appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, General Jones. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And I thank you, Mr. Kempe. And I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the interest you have taken attending this event, which I had hoped or wished would happen against a different backdrop relative to what we all are looking at. A completely tragic situation in terms of the horror that has been going on for long 25 days, the past 25 days. Death, destruction, we're talking about since the event was prepared for and promoted, of more than 1,400 people, including many, many children, more than 8,000 wounded. Many today are in life-threatening situation, made even more life-threatening given the very poor conditions in the Gaza Strip in terms of medical care and healthcare facilities, in addition to untold damage to infrastructure, housing, and what have you, leaving 300,000 people displaced. This is the extent of the damage and tragedy that's been unfolding for the past 25 days and counting, with unfortunately not there being the prospect in the immediate future of a ceasefire. Of course, I hope I'm wrong on this, and we've been all following this with a great deal of hope that the efforts underway, efforts that have been made toward reaching some kind of arrangement that would secure a ceasefire would be successful. Still hope and pray that they will be. That's the most important thing, given the extent to which the situation has been, the horror it has been. Of course, what is really important beyond the obvious, which is to secure ceasefire in short order, I mean, that's really the most important thing, is to see what needs to happen in the period immediately ahead or following that in order to build on that ceasefire, to ensure that it is durable, to ensure that as things begin to converge toward a new normal of sorts, that new normal is fundamentally different from the old one. We've been there before, with the old normal meaning specifically that a way was found on at least a couple of occasions before then, before this time around, where agreement was reached, tentative agreement, with not really much hope or expectation that was going to be lasting or durable, with preparation for the next round literally beginning immediately after the ceasefire was secured. I hope this time around will be different. But first things first, let us get that badly needed, urgently needed ceasefire. This is, I mean, the second part of thinking, placing it in more like a medium-term to longer-term context is absolutely important. I know it's tricky. There is a dilemma here. Anytime you have a crisis situation, it's very difficult to introduce elements of strategic nature or longer-term implications. Who wants to talk about that? Who cares to listen at time of this untold death and destruction, tragedy and misery about long-term or strategic dimension to what's going on? At the same time, unless those considerations are factored into the discussion, unfortunately, the situation would be one of moving from a crisis to the next one. Besides, I happen to believe, in the context of the current tragedy that we're looking at, that's unfolding and continues to unfold before our own eyes, thinking strategically or seemingly longer term is absolutely essential in order to make the ceasefire promise to be a lasting one or durable one relative to previous efforts made in this direction. The focus of my remarks will be on this. And I think, in a way, the title suggested by my colleagues in the Council, and I'm proud of the association, and thank you for the opportunity, and I hope and I look forward to working with you and others in the period ahead to promote ideas related to this very conflict, but also to the broader region, which continues to be highly unsettled and really going through a period of unprecedented turmoil, with unprecedented violence, extremism, and of proportions and dimension that has not been seen. As a matter of fact, one really has to go back in history a long, long time before one can find a parallel to the kind of grotesque violence, unprecedented violence that has been taking place for a long time, and unfortunately threatens to continue to be the case in the foreseeable future. Against the backdrop of all of this, and the title suggested for this conversation, which I'm eager to have with Jeff Kempe in short order, the title that says, Breaking the Vicious Cycle. The choice of title, which was not mine, actually imparts the dimension to this conversation that I have just alluded to, which is what do we do in order to ensure that the new normal is fundamentally different from the old one? And if that's not really enough, and I think in the words of a woman in Gaza sitting by Ahmed specifically, and I make a mention of this in my prepared remarks, which will be made available to you at the conclusion of this conversation, sitting by the remains of what used to be her home only 2 weeks ago, destroyed completely by an airstrike, sitting there and pointing to it and saying, even before this, she said, we don't have much to lose. Even before this, we don't have much to lose. So much misery. We were alive simply because there was not enough death to go around. I thought the most important, significant words of this kind, in addition to what we just talked about in terms of the title as defining this conversation that's to take place, this is really as good a reason as any for us to engage in this kind of conversation, discussion in terms of what needs to happen to place this in a context that ensures no repetition of the tragedy that has been unfolding over the past 3.5 weeks. And as we do, there are some ideas that I have put forward that involve certainly not, rushing back to a political process that has gone through yet another round of failed diplomacy without adjustment, nor to focus on that exclusively to the point where the effort that needs to continue to be made in earnest now to secure a ceasefire, but rather to consider what it is that has to be done in the light of the experience over the past 20 years or so, and particularly over the past 15, since the presumptive date of end of discussion or negotiation of so-called permanent status issues under Oslo Accords. What is it in light of that experience that should be taken into consideration to inform a process that could lead to introducing badly needed adjustment to promise better delivery, so that we would not really end up doing this over and over again, expecting different results when those cannot possibly obtain. That is really the direction in which I decided to take this conversation in the form of the remarks that I have prepared for this conversation, which again will be made available to you. And there I suggest, as a matter of fact, the importance of taking a new look at some of the more important precepts and components of the existing framework, policy framework, negotiations framework, or peacemaking framework, if you will. One relates to the fundamental question of Palestinian representation. Who represents the Palestinians in this, and what is it that that party actually represents? And the other one, the other element, or the other area of possible adjustment I feel would be necessary to take a good look at is the design of the original framework, that's Oslo. I would want to make it absolutely clear to you, this is not going to be an argument for ditching the existing framework, forgetting about it or anything like that. This is not about a statement that says, let us abandon the two-state solution concept. To the contrary. In thinking through the adjustments of the kind that I'll be talking to you briefly about, actually what I had in mind was steps necessary to be taken and undertaken in order to ensure that viability of the path to Palestinian statehood, which is absolutely necessary, can be restored in order for this framework to be successful. And very briefly now, on those two key areas of adjustment or possible adjustment that need really to be re-examined thoroughly. On the question of Palestinian representation, there is the issue, quandary, if you will, of there being essentially two camps. One that happens to have the de jure power of representation, and that is the PLO, but without much effective presence, with one that has really waned over time for a variety of reasons, including most importantly as a direct consequence of the failed political process or field process. And on the other, another group, another camp, that does not have the jure power to represent or the privilege to represent in a de jure fashion, but has real strength and field presence in ways that cannot be ignored. The doctrine has so far been, deal with what exists, and the framework that does have the de jure power to represent, reach a peace agreement or agreement, and that the process itself plus the outcome would be transformative enough to really take us all to a successful end, if you will, conclusion. That has not happened. It has not happened over the past 20 years. And I would say, over the past 15 years, since May 1999, when this was supposed to have been, concluded by agreement and through negotiation, and it wasn't. If anything, the goal, chief deliverable out of this political process looks more distant today than it looked then, back in May 1999 or at any point before. And that is really a serious problem, and one that really did contribute to the standing of the PLO being what it is. So that's a point that needs to be considered as we really move forward, both in terms of its implications for overall peacemaking effort, but also in terms of its relationship with the question of national Palestinian governance. How much longer can you keep on going with the country separated and with this much marginalization going on, and without adequate representation and various faction parties having enough presence and a sense of partnership when it goes on? So there's the international requirement on the one hand, requirements of peacemaking, but also requirements of good governance that would require really taking a good look at it. Last, it's the second issue that I would deal with. The second issue that needs adjustment, and that's the overall design, if you will, of the Oslo framework. Once again, emphasizing that what I'm not really talking, I am not talking about forgetting about that framework, but really fixing it. Oslo, and many people forget, was about an interim arrangement. It was not a permanent arrangement or anything. It was supposed to have ended. It was supposed to have culminated in successful negotiations on so-called permanent status issues. Was supposed to, and implicit in that construction, was the emergence of a state of Palestine, something that was not elaborated with this explicitly, at least, before, at least in the United States, June 2002, when the emergence of a viable state of Palestine, living side by side with the state of Israel, was put forward as the way forward, as the solution concept, and thereby making it, those were the words of former President George W. Bush, thereby making it universally accepted doctrine in terms of how to end this conflict. And I'd say, a lot of things, did not happen the way they're supposed to happen. And that is why I think we really need to go back. But Oslo itself was supposed to be an interim arrangement. May 1999 was supposed to be an end. It did not happen. The arrangement may have made sense or could have been understood to make sense because it was interim. Because actually, by virtue of signing, the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian side, by virtue of signing the Accords, in a formal sense, accepted the occupation or continuation of occupation in a formal way for a maximum of 5 years beyond the 26-year period that had elapsed since then. That's the essence of the Oslo Accord, and it could be understood this way. But not forever. It was accepted as an interim period. That's the sense of it. Past May 1999, nothing made sense anymore. Once that threshold was crossed, what was an interim arrangement became an open-ended arrangement, and hence the degradation in the standing of the PLO in the eyes of the Palestinian public. Its reputation, its standing, beginning actually signing Oslo Accords, hinged critically on its success in delivering life, freedom, and dignity in a country of our own, for Palestinian people, that is. And that obviously has not worked out. And past May 1999 became open-ended, with the reality being there, basically, to put it bluntly, Palestinians being told, go on, continue to negotiate with Israel, accept what Israel has on offer for you, or else accept the reality of continued occupation. That doesn't make sense. And that's why I say, this side, this part of it needs to be looked at again. That's not what Oslo was supposed to be like. That part needs to be reconsidered. Question before us all, how do we make sense out of both of these considerations? How do we put them together in order to come up with a concept that can, on the one hand, reinforce the effort underway to secure a ceasefire, but then, importantly, to sustain it? With this introduction, I submit to the interrogation by Jeff and to questions and answers, and I hope we'll be giving maximum opportunity for that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much. Thank you.
Thank you for submitting to interrogation. Thank you for those opening initial comments. I missed saying something that in these modern days, you said this at different times that I was supposed to say right from the top, and that is for those of you who are tweeting, it's #ACGaza, #ACGaza. This is all on the record, obviously, and not only will the full comments be made available physically outside at 5 p.m., but we'll also have them on our website, if I know our team, right at the same time. So I think it should be at the same time. I do want to give a special greeting to Steve Hadley. I didn't see he was in the audience right in the beginning, who's been so much a part of bringing Dr. Fayyad here. It's wonderful to see our friend Jane Harmon here from the Wilson Center, with whom we've done some good work. And many board members and members throughout, thank you for being here. Let me start by drilling down on what you were saying. You were essentially saying we don't have the representation right, and we don't have the framework right. I mean, essentially.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what should the representation be? What should the framework be?
There's more than, I hope this is okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is really a very complicated problem here. On the one hand, the Oslo Accords were signed onto by the PLO acting on behalf of all Palestinians. And those accords involved early on, and that's really the essence of so-called Declaration of Mutual Recognition. Recognition by the State of Israel of the PLO as a representative Palestinian people. And that defined the process, and that defined the Palestinian counterpart in the process. And as I said, that point in time onward, this is the criterion by which the PLO was to be judged, the extent to which it was going to be successful in delivering freedom to Palestinian people and Palestinian statehood. That didn't happen, as I alluded to in my opening remarks. And if anything, as a matter of fact, that goal appears to be more elusive today and more distant than it did then. Not surprisingly, the standing of the PLO has eroded over time, consistent with and concomitant with an erosion in the terms of reference of the political process or the peace process. Things that used to be taken as for granted in the past, like, for example, discussions about 1967 being the border or presumptive border out of negotiations. All of a sudden, in more recent years, having become an issue of contention, whether or not it can be included in a policy document, including one put forward by the United States, not Israel. This is a remarkable erosion in the terms of reference in the process. This is not something that's easy. Thereby, this failure was very costly. It made the difference or space involved between the maximum on offer by Israel and the minimum acceptable to the Palestinians progressively wider and wider. So you had a PLO that had failed to deliver by the end of the 5-year interim period, which is all of it was interim period. But then subsequent to that, going through the second intifada, but then subsequently throughout the years, up until now, 2014, there's failure after failure after failure. One round of negotiations giving way to the next, except that the next round of negotiations started with the terms of reference having eroded even further. So the task of the PLO, acting on behalf of all Palestinians, having the de jure power to represent, the privilege to represent, the responsibility to effectively represent Palestinian people, but then looking at the situation is becoming more and more difficult to handle. At the same time, there were these other factions that never were part of the PLO framework. From the very beginning, they did not accept Oslo as a framework for resolving the Palestinian-Israeli issue, from the very beginning. And over time, and in parallel with this decline or erosion in the standing of the PLO, their power, even though, and field presence, if you will, strength, the extent to which their ideology resonated with people, notwithstanding the ups and downs of political cycles and sentiments and all, but over time, I think if one were to look at it in a trend fashion, one cannot really but see that there's been rise in their standing over time. And that happened to be reinforced by failure of diplomacy. And as a matter of fact, to become even more pronounced, especially more pronounced at times like these, when you have a most dangerous escalation, you have death and suffering and destruction and tragedy and all. And with them really actually, saying, look at what this other faction has brought you, or this other school of thought or ideology has brought you, nothing, failure. So you have a situation where you have these non-PLO factions standing on a platform of this kind, gaining strength over time, at the same time, the PLO acting on behalf of all Palestinians with the de jure power to represent losing ground. This is something that really needs to be fixed.
So you have to somehow bring these factions into the representation. Is that what you're saying? Or
it's very important for two reasons. One, I said there are two dimensions to this. The international, in terms of engagement with Israel and international community. But then there is the governance issue. What do you do about governing and about overall governance framework when certain factions are excluded? When they have at the same time this much power and field presence, if you will, not to mention the arms and what have you. But I'm really talking about what appear to be, again, perceptions-wise, a superior ideology. You know, at a time when, unfortunately, the thought started to kind of develop that, after all, violence pays off. Who's going to really win in a situation like this? Not the PLO that had really committed to a path of nonviolence to peace, but those who have all along said, you know, that's not really going to happen. And they would say, and I think that's a really strong argument, that where else in the history of national liberation movements had to lay down their arms before they secured independence. It's difficult to argue against that. I mean, when you really look at the history. But you would understand it in the Palestinian context only to the extent that Oslo was supposed to be an interim arrangement. You know, in the sense of it really promising delivery 5 years later, the commitments undertaken by the PLO on behalf of all Palestinians related to, number one, recognition of the right of the State of Israel to exist in peace and security, and also renounce violence, made sense in the context of the spirit coming to an end and delivering. But once that did not happen, once we crossed 1999, it started to become very difficult to really argue with this other school of thought. Additionally, the number of things that happened over this period of time that in a way validated that kind of thinking. And you can't ignore that in this day and age. You know, this is not the 19th century or the even 20th century. You have to make sense to people you govern. You can't ignore that. There are many things that happened over the course of the past 20 years that actually validated the theory that says, you know, violence pays off. There are many things that I can refer to, and not only in the Palestinian context, but actually in the region. Where we're talking about Lebanon, for example, and this all happened over the course of the, you know, Oslo framework, has nothing to do with the Oslo framework separately, and several instances of dealing between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. Take, for example, just one example, the Shalit prisoner exchange deal, where in one go, Israel traded the freedom of more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners to secure the release of Shalit at the time. Contrast that with the experience that we and the PLO and Palestinian Authority had to go through on the same file, trying to really secure the release of Palestinian prisoners. You know, what does that tell the public at large? Belligerence is the way to go. You can't ignore, you know, the perverse effect of events like this on perceptions. And you can't ignore perceptions. You can't govern without people. It's not good enough to say the right thing. The question is, can you carry?
Yeah.
Now, I submit to you, you know, in the light of the experience, and failed experience of diplomacy over the past 20 years, it's very difficult for me to see the Palestinian political framework as is able to carry. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. So, you know, that can't be ignored. I know in what I'm saying to you here, that drives people or tends to push them away from their comfort zones. This is not really traditional to many. And I wouldn't exclude myself from the characterization of many here. But look, there is tragedy going on. And there is tragedy that promises, unfortunately, threatens to repeat itself time and again. And there are consequences to failure. You can't, you know, ignore. You can't keep doing the same thing and really in the process do nothing more but kick the can down the road and then have all of these disasters and pretend that you can go back to the old framework and do it. You just can't. So I'm really sorry if this pushes some outside of their traditional comfortable comfort zones. Yeah. We need to really do something about this. Now, how to do it is a question. How can we do it is a question. I mean, this is not really, it's not that we're starting from principles with the, you know, luxury of designing things to the liking of everybody. But we need to take into account, you know, these complications.
Well, let's go to the how to do it question, because it seems to me that you're saying very passionately and articulately that this vicious cycle we're in can't continue.
I don't know about that.
And violence pays off, and we're also experiencing unprecedented violence. It sounds like you're prescribing changed representation in the Palestinian part because it's necessary and it's urgent, but without saying specifically what that should be, and a changed framework without saying specifically what it should be, but just saying that it has to change because it's not working. But you're not being specific. You're not prescribing a new framework.
This is fair. I'll do what I can to be more specific. I don't know if I can be too specific for the reason that what I have in mind is a set of ideas that I'm putting out for consideration, and what or the extent to which we're going to be successful in starting a serious discussion on this is important here, and I think it's really up to various factions and parties to this, whether domestic or foreign, to somehow coalesce on something. So it's what I'm really talking about here is the, if you will, the broad architecture of this, but not the specific details in terms of, for example, I talk about time-bound commitment to nonviolence. What does that really mean in terms of length of time? The concept is there, but it's really up to all concerned to really define it. But the idea is the following, the substance of it, and to be more specific than just to say, it needs to be adjusted. I sought to make the point that an adjustment was necessary, but then in what direction? What does it really mean? First of all, in terms of the existing framework, you have a PLO that, as a matter of course, and legality, if you will, international legitimacy, had entered into an agreement with the State of Israel going back in 1993 that is a great deal of significance. That cannot be ignored. And the power to represent was certainly there in a de jure sense. There was and continues to be there today. But then what do you do to make the adjustment? My own suggestion would be to leave the PLO alone. To not really get to the point of saying, let's undo this or open it up without any criteria anywhere that makes international engagement very difficult, if not really outright impossible. I'll just say, keep it as it is, with its right to represent in the way that's referred to in those agreements, but in the way that has, come to be known as the sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people. Leave that alone. But then in parallel, have a unified leadership framework that involves participation by everyone. All factions, whether they are PLO or non-PLO, they all there sitting at the table. And they, together, collectively, are to inform decision-making by the executive committee of the PLO. But what does it really mean? Is this really asking too much? Let's just say that the PLO executive committee doesn't like that or doesn't want to do that. Let's assume, but this is just for the sake of argument. I don't think they would. But what is the basis for the executive committee of the PLO or for the PLO to continue to engage in international diplomacy when it is not fully assured that it's going to really be able to carry? Again, we could really choose, the kind of game we would want to play, but we're not going to deliver results unless we really have answers, good answers to these questions. It is in the interest of the PLO and its executive committee, its leadership, to listen, to really have its decision-making process informed by other opinions, in order for it to be able to secure the consensus needed in order to deliver an agreement. After all, this is not going to really be just an agreement between two people, signing a piece of paper. This is the formality of it. But is it going to be possible to get to the point where there is going to be this moment, something which a lot of people have lost their lives for? It's very important to prepare for it right and not to continue to pretend. So no, I don't think anyone should say to this, certainly not the PLO itself, and it wouldn't, and I think it should welcome it. Now, what kind of processes are involved? And that's why I say this is really open for discussion. This is as much intended, at our own domestic political scene as it is at the international one. These are ideas. Exactly how we're going to constitute ourselves in order to create and operationalize this framework, which exists as a consequence of dialogue that has taken place to achieve reconciliation. How to operationalize it in a way that meaningfully informs decision-making by the PLO, which continues to serve as sole legitimate representative of Palestinians. That's one element of this. Another is how to govern domestically. Question of Gaza, West Bank, and separation. Anyone out there who thinks that there is going to be an end to this conflict and a state of Palestine emerging, a fully viable and independent, fully sovereign state of Palestine without Gaza, needs to really rethink their position. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Look at it from the point of view of those in Israel who are supportive of two-state solution. What is it that really they say to the Israeli public in order to make the case for a two-state solution. Clearly, their argument is based on the kind of government and country they would like to have. And so demographics are important in that argument. And time and again, I've seen them one after the other making the case for a state of Palestine on the basis of that. Without Gaza, if you take Gaza out of that mix, they will not have the argument anymore. So it's very important. So what do we do domestically? We need to have all of those parties adequately represented, fuller sense of partnership, if not a complete all-inclusive. This is in the interest of everybody. And at some point, there are two final elements. One, there needs to be a basis for consensus. There is a critical mass that is absolutely necessary in order to permit a takeoff here. I mean, without it, especially on security, it'll be a case of too many missing ingredients. Something needs to be agreed insofar as violence is concerned. I think there really needs to be an understanding of the need for there to be a period of nonviolence. If nothing more, a time-bound commitment to nonviolence. How long? Let that be discussed and agreed. But that's in the interest of everybody. And use the time, on the Palestinian side, use the time to rebuild, use the time to reunify the institutions of the people. Gaza and West Bank have been separated for 7 years now. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to reunify state institutions. This is not a trivial matter. These are matters that require, serious work. So you put all of these things together. Let us say that, a consensus can be forged on the Palestinian side on these critical issues. I think that's when we Palestinians should feel empowered enough to really go to the Israelis and international community and say, this is what we have, this is what we can and expect ourselves to do over the next period when we define it. Can we now, and this is really a most critically needed adjustment that's intended to deal with the design flow in the overall framework. Can we now agree on a date certain for ending the occupation? That's how you really put all of these elements together. Well, can we agree on a date certain for action? We just can't keep going like this. We need to start from the end. Yeah. Agree on a date certain for elections. The default to failure in negotiations cannot continue to be continued occupation. It has to be the certainty of an end to the occupation. Can we agree that? And then work backward. Then your domestic front and the international front, the engagement front, would begin to proceed in a degree of sense and coherence that makes sense to the people. And that's very important. They cannot really be left behind and, for us to expect the process to succeed and deliver.
Dr. Fayyad, thank you for that. Some in Israel would say, and let's come to the present tense situation on the ground. Some in Israel would say that the way to break the vicious cycle, as we're talking about, is to completely defeat Hamas once and for all to ensure its safety. That's exactly what Ambassador Oren, argued in the Washington Post recently. Then last week at the Aspen Security Forum, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, the head of the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, warned that if Hamas is totally defeated in the current round of fighting, it's likely that a more extreme group would rise in its place. I'd like to know your vision on this, and I know your job is not to advise the Israeli government, but what would your advice be to the Israeli government in this sense? You see the popularity figures of what's going on right now of Netanyahu rising. So, so first this question of what replaces Hamas would be more extreme, this tension between, say, what Ambassador Oren said and the head of the DIA, and then secondarily, if you were sitting in a room advising the Israeli government, what would you tell them?
I'd say quit it, to be honest with you.
You'd say?
Quit it. Mm-hmm. I mean, this notion that somehow you're going to really continue to engage in this escalation until it leads to the elimination of Hamas and other factions of the same kind, apart from the obvious tragic consequences of and implications of continuing fighting of the kind that has been taking place. And this is not really a small matter. I mean, we're talking about people's lives and loss of life that just simply cannot be tolerated. This is completely unbearable. And then what? Number one, I mean, everybody has to remember and know that we are dealing here, at least so far, with non-state actors. You know, Hamas is in control of Gaza, for sure. I mean, as far as, Palestinian governance is concerned, has been since 2007, notwithstanding the unity arrangement that was brokered recently or agreed recently. But effectively, it's there. But still, it has not, acquired, the status of a state operator. I mean, a state, if you will. It's a non-state operator. And this is really a quandary. Not only insofar as factions of the Palestinian scene are concerned, but similar actors elsewhere in the world. A criteria of winning and losing, are different when you're dealing with non-state actors from what they are when you're dealing with state actors. Mm-hmm. We've seen this happen time and again. In your own experience in the United States with a country like Afghanistan, for example, in terms of firepower, and, bombing and the rest of it. Situations like this, we talk about ideology and we talk about survival of a few who, after the extensive damage to infrastructure, loss of life, misery, and all, would rise from underneath the rubble and say, we won. What are you going to do about something like this? This is serious. And your lives are at stake. And with futility, absolute futility. That's number one. Number two, whether or not you agree with Hamas and like-minded, factions is not as significant as realizing the need for any Palestinian leadership to carry in order for that leadership to deliver agreement. And you simply cannot continue to ignore the ideology and the platform, even if you disagree with it. That's the kind of world we live in. These are the kinds of standards by which, developed and advanced countries, live by. There isn't a set of standards for the developed, advanced world, another set of standards that should apply to others. I mean, it's time for all of this to be taken on board. And I think, it should not really be beyond strong leadership, enlightened leadership, to accept that at some point somebody, needs to pay for failure. This is not, 1990, 1991. We're, more than 20 years past Oslo, and more than 15 years past, the end of the timeline under Oslo. And to somehow pretend that we're just starting this, and to really take a purist approach to this, wanting to really, solve it in a manner that conforms to the highest standards of what someone would like to happen, is, I think, extremely unrealistic. Nor do I believe would be right, and that's really important. Inclusiveness. You need to include and you need to govern in a way that's effective enough to ensure that there is sufficient support, critical mass of support for that which you stand on. Otherwise, you should not be really there representing others or people in conflicts. This is essentially what we're looking at. It's a necessity, in other words. But to think, this way is, I think, most counterproductive, is destructive. And unfortunately, after a loss of thousands more lives and a lot more suffering, people will come back to the same conclusion. It's not Hamas per se. It's that ideology. What do you do? What do you say to people who look at the record over the past 20 years and tell you, what have you done for us? What do you tell them? Forget about Hamas. Let's just put Hamas aside. Unless you're able to be convincing and credible and to make sense when you say, we have an alternative and this is what it really means, you need to really provide an answer to that question. Hamas or no Hamas. So if a solution is what we're interested in, we need to show enough courage to be accepting of being pushed away from our comfort zones in the direction of finding something sensible and avoid loss of life. Finally, on the other point that you raised, the region. And I sort of alluded to this in my opening remarks. State of upheaval. I mean, really, when it will end and how it will end, only God knows. But there are very few people I know who would have expected things to be the way they are today, but they are. I mean, in terms of extremism, violence, and the rest of it. This is unprecedented, and I think it defied expectations of many in terms of what's going on. The degree of extremism, you see this through a variety of channels and means, extremely grotesque and certainly alien to any kind of decency, if you really think about it this way. What do you really need to do to somehow stem this and prevent this from becoming an ideology? Now, if it's driven by, managed by, and led by few, unless something is done, I'm afraid this is really going to be the most dangerous phenomenon. Key to the solution lies in good, honest, responsive government, one that responds to the needs of people. Good governance is really key antidote to this. In the Palestinian context, this is not an add-on. It's not a luxury, something that's really absolutely essential.
Let me ask a very quick question, maybe a quick answer to get to that. Then I want to turn to Steve Adley to start the audience discussion with the first question. I want to pick up on what you just said. Tom Friedman in April 2013, when you resigned, wrote that Salam Fayyad was the Arab Spring before there was an Arab Spring. He described you as a part of a new generation of decent Arab, or what was needed was a new generation of decent Arab leaders whose primary focus would be the human development, their own people, not the enrichment of family, tribe, sect, or party. And that part of the difficulty and the failure of the Arab Spring was non-corrupt, that there was not enough support in the Arabs, US, Israelis, for non-corrupt institution-focused leadership. Do you agree with that? Has the Arab Spring failed, and are these the reasons why the Arab Spring has failed?
I like to believe it's still in the nature of work in progress, although it's really hard to use those words to describe the state of play when you're looking at the extensive or the extent of violence and extremism that has been taking place, continues to take place. Nevertheless, from time to time, I think it's really important to try to take a step or two away from what you see to put it in perspective. And I think it's useful to look at the experience of other nations and other revolutions. Going back, not that far back in history, recently, and see if things like this happened before, elsewhere, before we would come to the conclusion that things are impossible in the region, and that somehow Arabs are or belong to a species that cannot handle both democracy and stability at the same time. You really need to choose, either democracy or stability. That's a wrong-headed conclusion. We're like everyone else. We can handle democracy, and we need stability. Democracy sustains stability. You can achieve stability on the strength of force, but you cannot sustain it on the strength of force alone. Good governance can. That's what's really missing from this discourse. That's what's really important to really keep in mind. Now, looking at the history of this is the Arab Spring in the nature of a revolution. Revolution, people standing up for their citizens' right, for being respected, listened to, taken seriously, if you will. Not thinking that their most important tasking in life is to every day thank the Almighty for the wisdom of their leadership, infinite wisdom of leadership, and the largest of the leadership, and all of that sort of thing. Arab revolt and revolution, the Arab Spring, its essence is about this. Its essence was about this. That's what really, and I think in that sense, it was overdue. It took a long time. Deep sense of injustice, thinking that there was too much of double standards in the way the world was managed, the region itself was managed, the way the global West was relating to the region, the Arabs were siding with regimes that were not doing the right thing for their own people, only because those regimes would represent that the case for them was the case against the alternative, with the alternative first being communism and then Muslim Brotherhood. And this is what you get. You get basically a region that's unhappy. And so therefore, in that sense, people, it was overdue. But it happened. It's in the nature of a revolution. Now, where else are you going to really tell me that there was an experience with the revolution that delivered stability immediately afterwards? Didn't happen, not even in this country. It didn't happen with the French Revolution. It took 3 of those. It didn't happen in the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And so, yes, the extent of the violence is abhorrent. There's no question about that, and it needs to end. But to think that somehow, that the Arab Spring, in the way it has been, or if it is really about a revolution, I think it is fundamentally, to expect it, to deliver serenity, stability, tranquility in the immediate aftermath of a major upheaval like this, I think is expecting too much. I think two things. Number one, we need to place it in that kind of perspective to begin to get a better handle on it. But I think it's really time for everyone to begin to think that this is a region like all other regions. These are people like all other people. People are people. And standards have to be laid out for systems of government, of governance that respect their own citizens. This is so basic, but it's really, basically obvious, but somehow often conveniently or expediently ignored in the interest of trying to find a solution immediately, top down. You're not going to really get there without people, and to have them, you need to respect them. That in a nutshell is what I think.
Fascinating answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Fayyad. Steve Hadley.
I have to make a disclosure that I had the opportunity to have lunch with Salam Fayyad and Ziad Asali today. And I want to, if I can, invite you to share a little bit about that conversation. And I recognize that there are some sensitive pieces to it. But the reason I say that is because I think there's a lot of despair in the United States that the current situation in Gaza can lead anywhere positive. And I think it's useful if you could share some thoughts about that, both to give some hope, but also to stimulate some thinking. And I'm thinking specifically some comments you made about the kind of ceasefire that might allow both what the Israelis want, which is the demilitarization of Hamas, and what might allow Hamas to get what it wants, which is the opening of the borders for flows of goods and services. We talked a little bit about that, what kind of arrangement might permit that, the role that the PA might play in that, and also the issue of reconstruction of Gaza and how that might be structured in such a way that actually could begin not just a reconstruction process, but a reform process that could begin to do what you talked about, getting these institutions in a line between Gaza and West Bank. I admit these are sensitive questions. I think what you said was very interesting and would be useful, and I would just simply invite you to share that portions that you're comfortable with.
Thank you very much. No, I would be explicit on those issues. I think it's really important to place this in the right context in terms of how to deal with Gaza and to begin to bring that into the discourse. As I said in my opening remarks, it's hard to introduce strategic thinking into policy debate at a time of crisis. But in this particular case, I think bringing that forward may help in facilitating agreement on a ceasefire, if people begin to really get a sense of what is going to follow afterwards. Notwithstanding divergence, which is obvious in terms of the demands and expectations. Take, for example, what you said about demilitarization of Gaza. I'd say that would be a tall order now. Gaza was not demilitarized even when the Israeli army was there. Minus the rockets, there was just about everything else, including the tunnels. This is reality. So for someone now to come and say, Hamas, Gaza should be demilitarized, as a condition for ceasefire, that really is setting the bar too high. No agreement on ceasefire is possible. Death, injury, misery, epidemics, as a consequence of no water and the power plant having been, bombed and water stations and the rest of it. It is just simply unrealistic. The rest of the demand, there is, on the Palestinian side, the legitimate demand and expectation for lifting siege on Gaza. One really needs to, separate issues here. Rafah is a key point And there's a lot of focus on Rafah. But I argue that I think it's important to really take Rafah out of the discussion in terms of, not completely out of discussion, but not to make the debate on access exclusively one of what to do about Rafah. Rafah now is a bilateral issue, in Egypt and Palestine to resolve. And I think all along the idea, post 2007 is not what the case used to be in 2005 at the time of agreement on movement and access. But since then, after 2007 and the rest of it, it became exclusively a Palestinian-Egyptian issue. I think it's important. But even before, and I think really sadly didn't happen, it should have happened before. Nobody really needs to get into escalation or anything like this, to really solve a problem of access across Rafah. That was outstanding before. It should have been dealt with before in discussion between Palestinians and Egyptians. And the solution to it, even at time of separation, before the national unity government, would have been to open it subject to it being run and managed on the Palestinian side by the Palestinian Authority. Something that really made sense, even at time of separation. It would have brought the PA back into Gaza for the first time since June 2007. Important, something to build on. Could have paved the way for formation of national unity government afterwards. But to begin with that, something basic, something as basic as that, didn't happen. It should be approached this way. But certainly should not mask the need for resolution of access issues elsewhere. Rafah matters, for sure. But from our point of view as Palestinians, opening Gaza northward, connecting it with the West Bank, is strategically a lot more important. Rafah should be open. Subject matter of discussion between Palestine and Egypt. The world knows about it. But what about northward access? Wouldn't excessive focus on Rafah alone end up pushing Gaza southward, if you will, euphemistically speaking, or in the direction of becoming a standalone entity forever? And what would that do to the Palestinian cause, to the cause of peace in the region, to the two-state solution concept? So it's something that requires immediate attention. It didn't happen before. It should happen, but that should not be something about ceasefire or no ceasefire. This ceasefire is absolutely necessary, and that discussion needs to begin. Egypt needs to say, in order for my national security interests to be protected and safeguarded, the following arrangements should be respected at the Rafah crossing. And I think Palestinian side would be more than willing to accommodate. The state-like structure of Palestinian side, meaning the Palestinian Authority state of Palestine. And now that there is unity, even though it's not deep enough, it has not taken hold, I think it should happen, regardless of what happens elsewhere. But the discussion on access is absolutely important. But then again, at this moment, what can happen to immediately change the landscape? History tells us and experience tells us that it takes time, for these things to happen. You need to really secure the ceasefire, but you need to give people a sense of what is going to come later. Short of demilitarization. And again, if you really could have everything, you'll have everything. This is natural. This is what economics is about, after all. But we can't. You have to make choices. Here is a proposition. You're looking at a situation where you're a state of Israel demanding demilitarization. I don't think that's really realistic. I don't think it's really in the cards. Again, they were not able to achieve this even when they were in Gaza itself. Let's face it. What kind of nonsense is this? To really insist on that being a condition precedent for ceasefire. That doesn't work. But short of that, what if there is serious consideration of a promise of a period of calm, total commitment, by consensus, by everybody on the Palestinian side? Not the ultimate objective. We surely, look forward to the state of Palestine to be one that is really based on, coexistence and total respect for agreements and renouncing violence and to assume fully a posture of non-belligerence vis-a-vis anyone, including State of Israel, post-independence, but there's no question about that. But in the run-up to that, what if we can, and I say what if, I don't have this in my pocket, but what if we can, commit everybody on the Palestinian side to a time-bound, commitment to a period of calm? That's not demilitarization, but surely better than the existing situation. That is why I say, we really need to look at the situation, look at, unfortunately, it's not a choice between good and bad. It's a choice between better or worse. But in this particular case, I would say, given the horror of it, it's time to really have, number one, a ceasefire. Two, the promise of period of calm. That's better than not having anything, short of what Israel says it really would like to see happen. But it gets things going. It requires a greater role for the Palestinian Authority, one in which it really has presence in Gaza, not of the kind that has happened post-unification, which really has not happened. I mean, it's not deep enough. It's formalistic, if you will, so far. Well, what we really need is for a government that really actually fully and adequately represents, one that is inclusive, one that is seriously supported by the factions, but one that can gain strength and presence, possibly in a way that could make it an effective player. And remember, that was part of the thinking early on in terms of what the Palestinian government was supposed to do. Going back to the roadmap and the role of an empowered Palestinian government and the rest of it. This is not a small issue. This is something gives an opportunity for people to be included. And I prefer, personally, for it to be inclusive of factions themselves in order for it to really be adequately supported by them. This is a time of national crisis, to be honest with you. It does require commitment to nonviolence of a kind that would give everybody the time needed to rebuild, to unify, but at the same time to agree with Israel and the world on a date certain for ending the occupation. Absent that, we can't really push on the domestic front with the international front sort of really left undealt with. Something like this, I think, would be necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Fayyad. Jane Harman.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see a dear friend in Washington. Really a pleasure, and congratulations to the Atlantic Council for this enormous coup in getting our friend Salam to join you. Two things. First of all, everyone in this audience wishes you were still Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. I speak on behalf of everybody here.
Any dissenting voices, please be silent.
And we all remember the two-year plan you produced to prove the capability of the Palestinian Authority to run an independent state of Palestine. Would that were still here. But that is what my question's about. The PA has done a pretty good job of running the West Bank, and Ramallah is reasonably successful, and so are other parts of the West Bank, notwithstanding some efforts to build settlements and other things that Israel has done that are viewed in a very divisive way. Is there a way now, given the fact that the Arab neighborhood is not fond of Hamas, to use that story with their support to help build a coalition for enhancing the PA's role, something you've just suggested, as part of the solution, which would include a ceasefire, which would include an agreement for, I would hope, demilitarization of Gaza. I understand that's a hard thing to do, but also an agreement for a version of a Marshall Plan to rebuild Gaza and run Gaza as part of the demonstration program, and hopefully as eventually part of a state of Palestine. I mean, can more be done leveraging the views of the neighborhood about Hamas to give the PA the role it has really earned in light of its governance of the West Bank?
I don't think it's really, fortunately, I don't think it's a case of either or. I mean, first of all, let's keep in mind when we say ceasefire by whom? Agreement by whom? Mainly Hamas. I mean, there is Islamic Jihad, of course, that's involved, but they are the ones calling the shots. On the Palestinian side, who is really actually committed to this? And when you really take that into account, and the fact that they're going to be there, post this agreement, it's difficult for me to see a situation where a PA, which at present doesn't have much of a formal presence in Gaza, and that has been the case since 2007. Without putting together an arrangement that is open to being more inclusive, being able to somehow act only as an agent for reconstruction while ignoring these other components. I mean, again, I think it's really a question of choosing a realistic path toward achieving that. And now, what the process of reconstruction itself would do, what governance framework, overall framework would do if right policies are adopted and procedures followed, and something that made sense to people prevailed in terms of shaping views. This is most interesting, area for consideration. I think one needs to be patient, and two, one needs to keep into account that there are elections in the ideas that I'm proposing. I mean, I didn't say something about elections so far, but I think it's important. When we're building toward having a democratic state, one that would constitute a qualitative addition to the region, built on strong, progressive, universally shared values of openness, tolerance, non-discrimination, what have you. We need to rebuild our political system democratically, and we need to be able to have elections. Not immediately, it's impossible to do. But as this process moves on and the system begins to be opened up for more participation, broaden the base of participation, opening it up, and then have elections at the same point. At that point, if that happens, if that's what elections produce, I think that is something that's a lot easier to sell. In the interim, given where we are, I think we really need to somehow find a way. We need to improvise and find a way as a bridge between now and then. Because it just seems to me very difficult to conceive of a situation. We're going to dislodge those in the driver's seat and say, give right of way, time for someone else to handle this. Well, excuse me, but we've been leading. We're the ones on the front line, et cetera, et cetera. It's our ideology that has won. What are you talking to us about? Money or no money? Source of funding or no source of funding? Again, this is really part of this course one has to be sensitive to. How to really approach this? Think seriously about putting something that could enjoy critical mass of support, adequate, just enough to enable it to begin to deliver, rebuild, and implement policies that do all of these things and open the system, political system up, and then have elections. And what they produce, they produce.
Thank you very much. Okay, questions, please.
Good afternoon, sir. 22 years ago, I was the staff author of a law that requires the State Department to report on the rights of indigenous peoples around the world in its annual human rights reports. Unfortunately, in terms of Israel and the occupied territories, there is no report on indigenous peoples. And yet, if you use the term indigeneity as defined by the United Nations, it would both force Israel's neighbors to recognize Israel as being authentically indigenous to the area, as well as require Israel to then recognize the Palestinians as having a right to their homeland. In other words, a nation state that is viable. Why isn't the question of indigeneity part of the new paradigms that need to be discussed in the future once the bloodshed dies down?
Actually, my argument is for something less than that, to be honest with you. My own argument is for something less than that. In order to, among other things, close the circle of question of recognition, going back to 1993, so-called Declaration of Mutual Recognition, when the PLO, acting once again on behalf of all Palestinians, recognized the right, this is language, specific language, quote, the right of the State of Israel, to exist in peace and security. That's what has not happened. What did not happen then and has not happened since was for there to be reciprocal recognition by Israel of our right, Palestinians' right to an independent state. That, I think, should be adequate, to really, put the process on a more symmetrical path, going forward. And that, in some way, begins to address the deep sense of insecurity and sense of impossibility and outright disillusionment. That's so prevalent on the Palestinian side when they see, the daily expansion of settlements and what all of that is doing, the heavy weight of the settlement enterprise of Israel in terms of the prospect of continued viability of two-state solution. You have a formal recognition of our right to statehood. I mean, is this really too much to ask for? After all, Palestinians did recognize the right of the State of Israel to exist in peace and security in 1993. Contrary to conventional wisdom, everybody thought, given the name of it, Declaration of Mutual Recognition, that State of Israel then recognized the right of Palestinians to say it did not happen. Actually, for much of the period since 1996, governing coalitions in Israel, the platforms, different parties, were, to say the least, not very friendly to the concept of two-state solution. And so it is important for there to be that recognition, for starters. But I'd leave it there. I would not really I would not take it beyond that. I mean, that's the basic requirement that's really needed. I wouldn't really, take it to the next level in terms of, what kind of state and in terms of its characterization and indigeneity and the rest of it. Let's just really make sure that the formal framework is adequate to carry and move on.
Thank you. Fred Hoff, senior fellow here, and you may want to add a sentence about the role you've played in Mideast peace issues.
Thank you. Dr. Fayyad, you mentioned that a possibly creative way forward in all of this, in terms of negotiations, would be to set a date certain by which the occupation would come to an end.
Correct.
Could you expand on what that actually means in terms of procedure, and what would it look like when that date is arrived at?
Yeah. I think that adjustment is necessary. Oslo, by the way, and not many people know this, Oslo itself was conspicuously and curiously silent on the issue of Palestinian sovereignty and statehood. It is presumed, it was presumed when Oslo was agreed that this is what the outcome was going to be, but you're not going to find any reference to Palestinian statehood or sovereignty in the Oslo documentation itself. Very, very strange when the understanding is exactly the opposite. And I think, again, that may have made sense given the history and given the difficulty involved in getting people together to sign onto something. And I would not belittle or take away anything from the huge significance of the signing on the White House lawn in September 1993 of those agreements. I mean, that's very significant given the history and all. And I know many people who were there personally and how moved they were by that scene. It was very significant. But maybe at the time, to be fair to those who were engaged in the process, those who really actually involved, those who did it on the Palestinian side, maybe, at the time, the thinking that this was, going to be about a maximum of 5 years, and, it was going to happen, maybe justifies having gotten into it in the way they did. But there's no justification for continuing to go on with it without an adjustment that would create the presumption of occurrence of that which we Palestinians most desperately would like to see happen, and which I argue is of equal importance to the Israelis. Because, sustainable peace and security in the region requires that, to be honest with you. So when you're looking at a situation where that's missing, then all of a sudden the framework is flawed. There are examples in history of where that happened, other cases where, occupation or authority of a certain power over another country ended. I can, for example, invoke reference to the way Hong Kong was, turned over to China. It was supposed to happen within a certain time period, in 1997, clockwork, it happened when it was supposed to happen. Now, there was a lot of discussion and negotiation in the run-up to that. But negotiations, should be about arrangements, they should be about assurances, but they should not be about principles. We should no longer, 20 years past Oslo, be talking about whether or not Palestinians do have an alienable right to live as free people with dignity in a country of their own as an expression of their natural right to the exercise of their self-determination right. I mean, we shouldn't be discussing this. It should be really behind us. That's what's missing. So I think with the end of Oslo having come to an end, we need to really define this. Let's talk about one that is feasible. But this is not to preempt negotiations. Having agreed on a date certain for ending the UK's authority over Hong Kong did not preempt the need for negotiations with China and others to produce the outcome that was produced. But then everybody knows what's in prospect. There is a certainty of it. You negotiate on arrangements, assurances, the principles of solution are out there. There is enough in the body of international law as it exists, various relevant resolutions of the United Nations that provide enough guidance insofar as the principles of the solution are concerned. Can we really agree on the assurances and arrangements necessary to underpin it? That's what it is. But then we can't really approach it in the way things are happening right now. There is an inherent asymmetry in the framework right now between the occupying power and the occupied. And without presumption of an end to occupation that is enshrined in a binding agreement, what this framework is telling Palestinians, go negotiate with Israel for however long it takes, and so long as you fail to agree, meaning so long as you do not take what is on offer, you have to accept the reality of continued occupation, oppressive occupation. That's just not, there's something wrong with this. That's, what I'm really saying needs to be fixed. So everybody needs to be assured about this. Certainly Palestinians. And that, I think, could make a huge difference in the discourse now. I mean, de-escalation, demilitarization was mentioned, period of calm. Empowering the Palestinian Authority, empowering the PLO. Can you imagine what it would do to the capacity of the PA to begin to look productive again if it is able to go to the Palestinian people today and say, we do have a commitment, binding commitment, enshrined in a United Nations Security Council resolution. And as I said in Aspen, Jane was there, this is one trip to New York I'd like to take. To be honest with you. That provides for a date certain for ending the occupation. That would immediately begin to give people a sense of hope. Negotiate, yes, we do negotiate. We understand that it's necessary, but there is no illusion as to what the outcome is. The outcome cannot be continued occupation. Exactly what is the incentive? And when you look at the framework and the huge imbalance, I mean, listen to what is said by cabinet officer after cabinet officer on the Israeli side about Palestinian statehood and two-state solution and all, including words by Prime Minister Netanyahu himself recently said that something to the effect that he was right all along, that he wanted people to know that he was, Israeli people to be right, to know that he was right all along about there not being a possibility, admissible possibility, of Israel relinquishing control over territory west of River Jordan. Now, what does that do to the concept of two-state solution? So there is that rhetoric out there, and it's significant. What do you do to provide assurance? What do you do to really get Israelis themselves to really begin to believe this is something that they really have to contend with? It's not a matter of choice. There is the question of a people that is living under oppressive occupation, which it does not want. And you can't continue ignoring this forever. I mean, I think it's really time for everybody to grow up and to approach this sensibly, but to ensure that as we move forward, they're able to bring people along, to carry, in other words, and that's really essential.
Thank you, Dr. Fayyad. I'm going to ask you a final question. We've run out of time. It's off Twitter from Julian Hintz in Paris, and I'll also put it in a different context as well. The question is, with Gaza in ruins and West Bank economically ailing, could economic development hold the key to solution of the conflict? I'll also put it a different way. You predicted when you were prime minister that we'd have a Palestinian state by 2011. A lot of your approach is what people called unilateralism at the time, which was you were less interested in the symbolism of recognition of a Palestinian state at the UN and more interested in what could get done on the ground. So take that question, but also lay on to this, when do you now predict there'll be a Palestinian state, and what would you do unilaterally right now in the Palestinian position to push this along?
That was constructive unilateralism. as opposed to something else called settlement activity and the rest of it. And I did not predict, actually, at the time that Palestinian state would happen in 2 years. What the program was about specifically, and that was inspired and motivated by political thinking. What I predicted and said we're going to be ready for was statehood. The program was about sending a signal to everyone, putting everyone on notice, similar to what I'm really saying today, in a way, putting everyone on notice that we Palestinians expect to be ready for statehood in 2 years. That was meant to say, if we are successful and somehow become ready for statehood, in the sense of being able to govern ourselves effectively and handle obligations responsibly, and seen this way by the international community, and therefore effectively answering questions that were really put forward in 2001, 2002, 2003 in the context of roadmap and others. If we were to be able to do this and reduce this whole issue to come to occupation, period, not occupation, but the idea was that this was going to be strong enough to bring about the transformation necessary to secure a solution. So what the program was about inspiring ourselves to get ready for statehood in 2 years and tell the people beforehand. It's not, the idea was not to pass the test and say, we took a test and we passed it without announcement, but to pre-announce it. I mean, that was really the important part of it. To actually say, go out and say, and this is what we did in August 2009. 2 years, we expect to be ready for statehood. That was the idea. Instead of saying, unless occupation ends in 2 years, we're going to turn the tables and all of that, we actually essentially said the same thing in a good way. We're going to be ready for state. Are you going to be ready for us? Are you going to do the necessary heavy lifting needed to bring the occupation to an end? In a technical sense, we succeeded. Because a year and a half into this, we got that recognition of the reality. Rob Danil knows about this, and he was a part of it. The others, countless others, of course. People gave us that birth certificate of the reality of State of Palestine. April 2011 was a very significant date for us Palestinians. Very, very significant date. A year and a half into the implementation of that program, we got testimonials by relevant international financial institutions and the United Nations. Certainly, I was talking about the World Bank, the IMF, saying something to the effect that Palestinians had crossed the threshold of readiness for statehood in the form of competent, strong institutions of state capable of delivering services to standards of existing countries. Countries have been around for a very long period of time. In some areas, actually, even excelling. It was really most significant. It's too bad that it did not really generate the transformation necessary on the political side. That was valid then, it's valid today. That process of transformation is needed in order to bridge that gap of expectations between the maximum on offer by Israel and the minimum acceptable to us. That state of Palestine needs to be allowed to evolve, to emerge. It's not going to really happen to anybody or for anybody. It is going to be in the interest of everyone. It certainly would be a fulfillment, an embodiment that Palestinians have been so desperately looking for, be able to live with dignity and freedom and country of our own. That's really what this is fundamentally about. And that is something that requires preparation and building, and through which some serious transformation. That's what this is about.
Dr. Fayyad, there are so many more questions in the audience. I'm sorry we haven't got time to get to them. Let me just close by saying just a couple things. First of all, the text of his full statement will be available out in the foyer and also online at atlanticcouncil.org. Secondarily, let me quote my friend Tom Friedman one more time in the article he wrote when you resigned as prime minister. He essentially said to the Palestinians, he had messages to various people in his excellent column that people may want to look at. But he said, if there is no place, quote, quote, if there is no place for a Salam Fayyad type in your leadership, an independent Palestine will forever elude you. I think we've heard today in these comments why Tom wrote that, and I think a lot of us in this room, and perhaps Jane Harman is right, all of us in this room may agree with that. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you for joining the Atlantic Council. We're just delighted that we'll be able to work with you. And on behalf of the audience, best of luck to you, your people in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.